All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon, wherever you're joining from. Let me know in the chat where you're joining from today. What country? What state are you joining from? Let's see where everybody's joining from today. Okay. Some of you may have had class with me. If you have not, my name is Mo Jones. I'm an IT professional. I'm also an educator. This is my 4th year here at Learn It. I've been teaching technology for a really long time. I have my degree in information technology, and I'm just a tech guy. I'm one of those geeks. I love all things tech, and Excel is my favorite application. And so I'm excited to just kind of share with you a lot of the pivot table tools here today. Now, pivot tables is a really big deal in the data analysis world because it's a really nice tool that is available right inside of your Excel, your Office 365 subscription. Has a lot of really, really nice tools. If you've never used a pivot table before, you're going to really enjoy seeing what a pivot table can actually do. Right? Let me know in the chat if you've ever worked with a pivot table. Right? So just simply yes or no. If you've worked with one before, if you've created one before, let me know as well. So just let me know. Have you ever worked with a pivot table? Okay. I will share the file with you. So if you don't want to follow along, you can go ahead and use that file, or maybe you just want to kind of see how things work, and you can grab the file after the 1-hour demonstration here. Right. So, all right, very good. Okay, so Gwendolyn says, yes, but would like to be able to do more of them. All right, excellent. All right. Okay, so a few of us have worked with a pivot table before. Okay, well, whether you've worked with one before or not, I'm pretty sure you're going to learn something new. We'll keep it basic though. We have 1 hour, so we'll focus on the essentials here as well. Right? This is what we'll take a look at today. We're going to insert a pivot table. So I already have some kind of sample data we'll be working with. I'm going to insert a pivot table from that data set. And once we insert the pivot table, we'll go ahead and build out a pivot table report. And the next logical thing to do is to filter the pivot table reports to just kind of get different visuals based on some basic conditions there as well. And then we'll go ahead and visualize reports with pivot charts as well. Right? So that's pretty much what we'll be covering today. Let's take a look at our data set. I'll go ahead and open up my Excel file here. So here's our Excel file. Now, the first thing you want to do is you want to just apply some data normalization, principles here before you upload your table into a pivot table. So typically, there's a few things that we look for, and there's a lot when it comes to data normalization, but at least you want to make sure that you have, meaningful headers, right? So if you have meaningful headers, because you're going to be referring to these headers by name when you're building out your pivot table. So they need to make sense. They need to accurately describe the data below. So for example, here's the transaction ID. We have the associate. We are offering our services in different regions. Here are the different types of services we're offering. We have several clients, and we're tracking the dates, which is really cool. We can use the timeline to get some date-related revenue in here. And of course, we're tracking the revenue. We're also tracking the customer rating as well. So mission accomplished. We have really nice, well-defined headers, and we're good to go. The other thing is, if you have labels, typically your labels are some type of unique identifier. So in this case, we're tracking the transaction ID, right, from 9:57 up to 10:45. We just want to make sure that none of these are duplicate values, because if we try to, count the amount of transactions, we're going to get some incorrect answers in here. You can use conditional formatting to locate duplicate values, right? So if you just highlight that column of data right here on the Home tab, you can use conditional formatting. If there are any duplicates, it will highlight those cells for you. So you always want to check to make sure that you don't have any duplicates if you're working with unique labels. Right? And then, of course, the other thing is you want to make sure all of your data is formatted properly. So even though this looks like a date, sometimes when you click, it will actually show up as a custom field. So you want to make sure all of your fields are formatted properly. Okay. So the revenue column is see, this is custom. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that this is converted to at least currency or accounting. So notice the revenue is set custom, so I converted that to currency or accounting. And everything else in here is pretty much good to go, right? So just a little bit, because I get asked that question a lot, what should I do before I start analyzing my data in a pivot table? You don't want to, insert your data into a pivot table and go backwards, right? To go back to your data and start cleaning up. Of course, we want to make sure we have no blank cells, right? We want to make sure all of our cells, we have what's called complete records. We're not missing any data in here. Why? If we were missing the revenue for transaction ID 991, when we run our numbers, it's going to be incomplete because we don't have the actual data there. Okay, so what exactly is a pivot table? If you have not worked with a pivot table before, pivot table is a nice way of rolling up all of your data into a nice, condensed table. So for example, if I were to tap you on the shoulder and ask you to present this data to our team in, let's say, 1 hour, well, you would need to prepare. You would need to think about some of the questions that may be asked, such as what is the average customer rating? Right? What is the total revenue? Who is our highest grossing associate? Right? So is it Jones, Acosta, Cohen, or Gupta? And how many total transactions did we have? Right? Transactions maybe by region, by client, by service. And if we were to try to answer these questions, we would need to insert a lot of formulas, using a lot of filtering. So would you rather scroll through your data, filter, insert calculations as you're presenting this data? Or would you prefer to look at all the data in a nice condensed table here? Right? So notice the difference. We have a lot of data here. Here's all the condensed information in a nice pivot table. So let's take a look at this. If you have not seen this before, it's a lot of numbers in here. But basically, here are the sales numbers for each region. So here's California, here's New York, and here's Texas. So we can say that New York had the highest revenue, 323,723. Now, on the left, we have our associates, Cohen, Acosta, Jones, and Gupta. And here are the totals. Right? So we can see here, our highest grossing sales rep is Acosta, 238,412. Right? So again, it's just condensing all the information for us. We do not need to write any calculations. And if you take a look here, we can answer a specific question. So what were the sales for Acosta in Texas? Right? We can see Acosta's revenue generated was 60,708. So pretty cool. And we can do other things. We can move things around. What if we want to focus on, let's say just the region? We can just, sorry about that. We can just go ahead and move things around like this. Right? And now we just have a simplified table showing the breakdown of revenue by region. Maybe revenue by service. Right? So every time we interact with these fields, we're basically asking another set of questions on our actual data. Okay. So again, here's the pivot table that condenses the information for us, summarizing our columns, running math on the columns, versus working with this large data set. So that's the benefit of working with a pivot table. Right? I'll show you a trick. When you're working with data like this, you can right-click on your data set, and you'll see the quick analysis tool. Right? This will give you some quick ideas in terms of what type of pivot tables you can create quickly. I just want to show it to you. Don't do it. We're going to build a pivot table from scratch here. But if I were to right-click on this data and then click on Quick Analysis, the Quick Analysis tool appears on the bottom here. If I were to click on the tables, here are a few recommended pivot tables, right? So this one is showing the sum of revenue by region, revenue by associate, revenue by service. So it's really focusing on the revenue there, right? And here is the actual customer rating as well. So it's a great way to roll up all the data that's in here. Well, let's go ahead and insert a pivot table. Let's go ahead and answer some of these questions here as well. There's a few ways you can insert a pivot table. We are working with the table here. If you click, once you click, you'll see the table design tab. I always like to work with tables when I'm analyzing data. So make sure you convert your list into a table. To convert a list into a table, you can just press Control+T on your keyboard. But this is already a table, so we don't need to do that. When you click on the Table Design tab, you'll see an option in the Tools command group to summarize this data with a pivot table. So that's one option. We can use that option there. Okay. The other one here, if I click on the Insert tab, here is the pivot table command. Right? So I'm going to click on my table, click on the Insert tab, and I'm going to insert a pivot table. So I'll go ahead and click here. And here we go. So it's just asking, the first thing it asks you is, well, where's the data that you want to add to this pivot table? And you can see it's already selecting the entire table for me. It's called Table 1. You could also rename the table to something more useful. Are we good to go? So it's grabbing the data from A4 down to row 48. So everything is highlighted. All I need to do here is press OK, because I do want to add the pivot table to a new sheet. If you want to, you can add it, like right here if you want to. But I like to add it to a new sheet so I have more room to work with. And I don't want to mess up this data here as well, right? So I want to keep the data separate. So I'll go ahead and insert it into a new sheet. So I'll go ahead and click on OK. And here we go. So it inserts a new sheet. In my case, it's called Sheet 3. So I want to rename the sheet to make sure it's something useful. Here's the pivot table on the left. It's just a blank canvas right now. I also want to rename the pivot table. Right now it's just called Pivot Table 4. So I'll go ahead and rename the pivot table as well. You can also click right here to rename the pivot table. Right. Over here on the far right, there's two things I like to do. I like to sort my fields A to Z. Right? It's not a big deal here because we only have a few fields. We can see them. But when you're working with really large data, let's say you have 30 fields, it's a good idea to sort them A to Z so you can just find them more efficiently. The last option here is if you click on the gear icon, you can actually change the views. Right? You may notice my view is a little different here. The default view is stacked. And right now I'm using the side-by-side view. Right? I'll do that first. I'll go ahead and change the view. So I'll click on the gear icon here. These are just kind of best practices before we start building the table. So here is, we have the two options here at the top, stacked or side-by-side. So here's the default. Right? So you can see the issue. If you have a lot of fields, you have to scroll through here. You can't really see all of them. And they're also not sorted A to Z. Down here on the bottom, we have our different area boxes we can work with. What do we want to display in the rows, in the columns, in the values? And do we want to filter by a particular field as well? So I'll change it to side-by-side. So I'll choose that second option here. Okay. And I'm good to go. I can also sort the field list here by clicking on this icon. At the very bottom, here is the sort A to Z option. Right? So I can do that here. We can also do that when we're changing the name of the table. So I'll just sort it here. Might as well. So I'm showing side by side, and I want to sort A to Z. And there we go. Right? So now I can easily find my fields because they're in alphabetical order. Okay, to rename the table, there's a few things that we can do. The quickest way is to click on the canvas over here. And right here it says Pivot Table 4. I can either right click on that and click on Pivot Table Options. And right here, I can go ahead and rename the table. So that's one way. But the other way is I can click on the Pivot Table Analyze tab. We have two tabs for pivot tables. We have Pivot Table Analyze and Design. If you click on the Pivot Table Analyze, on the far left, you'll see the little text box there where you can actually rename the table. So use either one of those two methods to rename the table. Right? So either right click on the pivot table and go to Pivot Table Options, and you can rename it right here. Or you can click on the Pivot Table Analyze tab and simply rename the table to the far left. I'm going to just click right here and I'll rename this table. And I'll just call this Revenue Report. So it's been renamed as Revenue Report. I also want to rename the sheet as well. Right now it just says Sheet 3. I'll call this Revenue Pivot Table. Okay, so I'm good to go. I renamed the sheet. I renamed the pivot table. I've sorted my fields A to Z, and I'm also using the side-by-side mode. Now I'm ready to go ahead and start interacting with my pivot table. Now remember, the first question we asked was, what is the average customer rating? So let's take a look at that. So to do that, I will drag the customer rating into the values box. You want to start with that values box here. And it's giving me a number here. Let me zoom in. It's giving me the sum of the customer rating. Well, that doesn't work for me, right? I don't want the sum. I want the average. Right? So how can I change this from summarizing the data to getting the actual average of the customer rating? Well, to do that, the best thing to do down here in the values box, if I click on this drop down, so if I click on this drop down here, a list comes up, and here's the value field settings. This is where I want to go. You can make a lot of changes in here, but I just want to make one change. I'll click on value field settings. And notice down here, it's summarizing the data. So instead of sum, I want to use the average, right? So don't summarize, just go ahead and find the average of those numbers for me as well. Now, optionally, if you want, you can apply a number format. Maybe you want 2 decimals or 1 decimal or 3. You can click on the number format. Right? So I'll click on number format here. And I want 2 decimal places. I'll go ahead and press OK. And then I'll go ahead and press OK again. So there we go. Now we have the average of the customer rating, which is 4.17. So we were able to answer that first question. Well, you may say, Mo, well, what's the average customer rating by region? Well, look what happens if I add the region here. Right. So now we can get the breakdown of the customer rating by region. It was pretty close. California is slightly higher than New York and Texas at 4.18. I can even go by client if I want to. So I can keep on adding data. So the way that this table is constructed right now, we're asking what is the average customer rating by region and client, right? Here are our clients and here are our regions. So just think about it that way. Whenever you add a field to one of these boxes, the table is going to pivot and update. And every time you add a field to these boxes, you're basically asking a question. Okay, well, that one was good. We figured out the average customer rating. Well, what's the total revenue? Let's go ahead and focus on the revenue now. So I'm going to uncheck the region just to reset my pivot table here. I'll uncheck all of those boxes. And now I want to focus on the revenue. You can either click on the revenue box or you can drag it to the values. When you click on one of these fields, the pivot table is going to either put it in the rows or the columns or the values, depending on the type of data that it is. So here we go. We have a single field in the values box. So our sum of revenue is $918,065. Right? So we're able to answer our second question there. As a matter of fact, I'll put the numbers in here. So 4.17. And then for the, so this is 918. I'll put the answers in here. Right. Oh, why is it doing that? All right, I'll skip that part. Stay on track here. Okay, so I'll go ahead and escape here. So now we have the revenue in here, but remember, we also want to know what was the revenue for each of our associates. So I'll go ahead and click on the associates here. Now notice it places the associates in the rows, right? So here are our sum of revenue based on associate. I'll show you a quick trick. When you have your table, you can sort your pivot table as well. So once it, if you have just a level 1 item like this, you can click on the data tab and you can sort from highest to lowest. And we can see Acosta is our highest grossing associate, and E. Cohen is at the bottom there, 222,029. Right. Okay, so we've answered those questions. Total revenue, highest grossing associate. Well, let's see what else we can do. Let's also figure out the revenue by region. So I'll click on region here. And notice what it did. It placed the region into the rows as well. So now I have 2 in here. I have the associate, and I also have the region in the rows. When you have 2 fields or 2 or more fields in one of these boxes, it creates a hierarchy. So associate is level 1 and the region is level 2. We can see that here. Here's the associate, level 1 item. And we can see the regions are indented to the right. So just like a list, these are level 2 items. You'll notice buttons on the left. You can collapse the fields. This is useful because maybe you just want to focus on the sales rep. And then if someone asks, well, what about the regional performance? You can expand each of these like that as well. Right? So pretty cool. But I prefer to show the regions in the columns, so to have more of a tabular format. So I'm going to drag the region from the rows into the columns. Right? So here's kind of the standard pivot table, type of look and feel that you're used to. And I prefer this one. But again, if you prefer the single column, that's fine. You can drag the region into the rows, right, to get that type of look and feel. And that's perfectly fine as well. You do save a little bit of space in terms of columns when you do that. You can also swap them. So what if you want the region to appear at the top and the associate to appear at the bottom? You can do that. I'll go ahead and drag the region to the top of the row. And now here are the regions. And then right here, we have the individuals. So if you were to read this pivot table, we can say the total revenue for California was $304,248. And J. Acosta's totals were $83,700. Right? And E. Cohen's totals were $63,877. So pretty cool. That's what the pivot table helps us to do. I'm going to put the region back into the columns here. Right. And we're good to go. Now at this point, you can continue adding more details if you want to, but when you're working with a pivot table, I encourage you to keep it simple. Okay, you do not have to use all of the fields in your pivot table. The more fields you add, the more confusing it's going to be, especially if someone is seeing the pivot table for the first time. So you want to be careful with that. So for example, if I wanted to show the client in here, right? Notice how it's getting bigger, a little more difficult to understand. If I also want to add the service, right? So now it's getting really big and kind of difficult to work with. So you want to keep it simple, right? Another thing to note is that you are able to create multiple pivot tables from a single data, right? So if you want to create another pivot table from the data, you can just go ahead and insert another table. You're not confined to just one pivot table. Okay, all right. So Very good. Okay, I'm going to simplify this. I'm going to remove the service. I'm going to remove the client in here. Right. Okay, so I'm sorry, I see some issues here in the chat. That file was shared. I'm not sure why you're not able to access it. If you can just sit tight, we're trying to fix that for you. We will make sure it's fully available after the session, right? So you can rewatch the recording and practice with the file. I apologize for that, but it is set up so that everyone can actually access that file. Okay, so let's talk about a few things here. Let's talk about filtering our pivot table, and let's take a look at slicers as well. Right? So the next logical thing to do is to start filtering out our pivot table. So there's one box that we have not used, and that is the filter box. So let's go ahead and introduce a filter in here. So let's introduce a filter for the client. I want to add the client into the filter. And you'll notice once I introduce the client into the filter box, we can see a filter here on row 1 that's called client. And it works exactly the way that we think it should. If we click on the drop down here, so we have a few clients. So let's say I just want to focus on the revenue based on tech innovations. And once I press OK, so notice how all of these numbers have updated, right? Because these numbers correspond to tech innovations. So we can see we did not have any sales in California for our Gupta, E. Cohen, right? So these are not blanks. These are just, it just lets us know that there were no transactions that meets this particular criteria, right? So that's a simple filter. If I click back on that filter, I can select multiple. So if I select Agile Industries and Tech Innovations, so if someone asks, well, what are the total revenue for Agile Industries and Tech Innovations? I can use this option. And I can say, oh, well, based on those two, we have 332,002. When we're running a filter, if you take a look at the pivot table fields over here, you'll notice that this filter icon is active. So you can actually filter your table right here from the pivot table fields as well. Right? So you can actually do that. All right, I'm going to clear this filter. So we don't really have a clear filter button here for this one. I just have to make sure that I select all to kind of reset this. Here's my 91865. There's another way that we can filter. You may notice that we have two built-in filters here. Right? So whatever we have in the rows, we can filter by. And whatever we have in the columns, we can filter by. Right now, in the columns, we have the region. So therefore, I can click on that filter and filter by region. In the rows, I have associate. So I can actually do that as well. It's a little confusing though. We can actually change this label here. It says column label. Well, it makes sense if I just change this to region, right? And this row label, I'll change that to associate. So now I can filter by associate, and I can go ahead and filter by region. So I'll answer a specific question. Let's see what the revenue was for Acosta and Gupta in New York and Texas. Okay, so Acosta and Gupta. And then for the region, New York and Texas. So no California. And there we go. So a very specific question. What were the what was the total revenue for Acosta and Gupta in New York and Texas? And here you go. So the table has reshaped, it's resized, it's recalculated, and it's pivoted. Now, if you take a look at this, we have 9 formulas in here. We did not have to write any formulas. The pivot table is doing all of that for us in the back end. And these are not just regular formulas, right? These are conditional formulas. If the region is New York and the associate is J. Acosta, right? So it would take us a very long time to construct a pivot table like this, but it's doing all the work for us on the back end. So we're good to go. Once again, notice the filters are accessible here for the associate and the region as well. So you can always use the filter box or you can use one of the row or column labels, right? So those are two quick ways that you can filter your pivot table. There is a third way, which is my favorite way. So this filter box is my least favorite. The row or column label filters, that's my second favorite, but my favorite way is by using what's called slicers. Right? Let's take a look at slicers, but first let's reset the table. So to reset the filters, I can click on the drop down here, and I can click on clear filter from associate. Right? So I can do it manually. If you want to clear all the filters that's running on your table, I'll show you a trick. If you click on your table and click on the data tab, over here to the far right, you'll see this clear filter icon. So if someone sends you a pivot table and you just can't tell how many filters are running, maybe there are 5 filters, you can just click on this clear button here, and this will clear all the filters that's running on the table. So I'll go ahead and click clear here. There we go. We're back to our 918,065. All right, well, let's take a look at slicers. To get to the slicers, we need to click on the pivot table so that we can get to the pivot table analyze tab here. Right. And right here in the filter command group, we actually have 2. We have slicer. So we're going to insert a slicer, and then we'll insert the timeline. We'll take a look at the timeline as well. So I'm going to click on insert slicer. And notice that we have a slicer for each of our fields. Here's one for the associate, one for the client, region. Right. Well, let's see how these work. Slicers basically has buttons that you can click on. And once you click on those buttons, it's going to control what's being displayed on the table. So that's a really cool tool. And it's a really nice thing to use when you're presenting your data in Excel. All right, I'll go ahead and introduce one for the client and one for the service. Right? So just client and service slicer. I'll go ahead and press OK. Actually, I'll add the region as well so we can see how that works. So client, region, and service, I'll go ahead and press OK. Here are my 3 slicers. Now you can move them around. You can resize them, right? You could even change the colors if you want to. I'm just going to resize these so that they're not taking up so much space. And I'll change this one to 2 columns. Just want to be able to see all of them kind of in one column here. Okay. So it's up to you, but that's just me. Right. Just a quick call out, the slicers have their own contextual tab. So once you select a slicer, you'll see the slicer tab that appears. You can choose a slicer style, and you can also change the number of columns that you're working with. Right. So if you want to do that, you can. So if I want to make one this color, that color, and let's say this color. Okay, so here are my slicers. Well, let's see what happens if I click on the California button on my region slicer. Notice how it filters the table, right? So it's only showing the details for California. Texas and New York are not on here. So pretty cool. I can use the slicers together. So what about Agile Industries in California? And look at that. With 2 clicks of the button, we can narrow it down. The grand total for Agile Industries in California, 44,853. Well, what about the service? We'll go ahead and add the service as well. Right? Real estate. So look at that. Right. What question are we asking? What's the total revenue for Agile Industries in California for real estate services? 24,747. So the pivot table allows us to answer that question quickly and efficiently. Now, if we wanted to answer that question here, we would need to do several things, right? We would need to run several filters and add the calculation for that as well. But the pivot table is taking care of all of that for us. Okay, what else can we do with the slicers? Right now, you may realize that we can only select one option at a time. I cannot select multiple. So if you want to be able to select multiple, there's several things that you can do, but just using the tool here, at the very top right of the slicer, you'll see the multi-select tool. So if you go ahead and turn that on, it allows you to select multiple. So I'll go ahead and turn those on for each of my slicers. And now I can select multiple, right? So here is Fusion Solutions. Let me make this a little bigger. There we go. All right, so 3 specific clients, 2 specific states, 2 specific services. So slicers are your way to go when you want to be able to just quickly filter and filter the data that's actually on your table, right? So pretty cool. Okay, on the top right of the slicer, to the far right, we have the clear filter button that you can use. Remember, we can also use the clear filter here on the data tab. That will clear all of these filters here. Okay, so you can either clear them manually or you can use the clear filter. I already used the clear filter, so I'll use, this time we'll use the clear filter for each slicer. So there we go. So we're back to our 918 from 65. So those are our slicers. Now to get rid of a slicer, you can just click on the slicer and press the delete key. I'm going to delete the client one, right? You can always bring it back just by clicking on insert slicer again. But for now, I just want the region and I want the service. One thing to note, let's see what happens if I change my data. I'll go back to my original data set here. So our grand total is 918,000. If I go back to my sales data, if I add another record, or if I modify an existing one, I'll just modify an existing record. So let's say this transaction here, instead of 23,000 was 45,000. Okay. So I just made a change to the source data. So let's see if the pivot table has been updated. And you can see it's not, right? So how do we update the pivot table? Well, we simply need to refresh the table. We just need to refresh the table and it will scan our source data, pick up the change, and recalculate the grand total for us. How do we refresh the table? If you click on Pivot Table Analyze, here is the refresh button right here. You can also right click on the table and just click on refresh. So you have 2 ways, typically 2 ways to do everything in Excel, right? So you can use either one of those methods. I'm going to refresh and let's see what the new grand total is. Right, so we can see the increase, 939,000. We can also see the increase for Jones, 248,609. Okay, so it's good to know. Another call out here. Your pivot table cannot break anything on your original data source, right? So it's just querying the data. So your pivot table, you cannot break anything. So feel free to move things around and just practice. Just drag the fields to the different boxes and see what outcome you get there. Okay, let's take a look at, let's take a look at the timeline. Right next to the slicer is the timeline. And what's really nice about the timeline is really cool because the timeline allows us to get things like, quarterly reports, right? Monthly reports, things like that. So a lot of our data is really time sensitive. So I'm going to insert the timeline. Now, remember what I spoke about earlier about just proper data formatting. The timeline only works with a properly formatted date field. So it's found the date offered in there. So you have to have dates in your data set if you want to use the timeline. You cannot use the timeline without dates. Well, let's see what the timeline looks like. I'll go ahead and press OK. Okay, so here is my timeline. Right now, it's showing me the year 2025, the entire year from January to December. So I can simply just click on a month. So if I click on January, in January 2025, here was my revenue. Right? Let me just make sure I don't have any filters running on here. There we go. All right, so I'll click on January. All right, so here is, so in January, we just had sales of revenue of 20,806. February, slightly more, 132,000. So you can see how the timeline is working. It's just figuring it out for us, doing a lot of math in the background and giving us the actual information. What about March? 148. April, 152. So we're going up, which is pretty good. Right? So we're increasing on a month-to-month basis. Slight dip here in June. So that's the timeline. Well, what about if I want to get some quarterly data in here? I'll click on quarters. And what were the total sales for quarter one? Look at that. Quarter one, 302,120. Quarter two, big increase, 462,908. This is a capsule, so I can drag it like this. Right? So here are the sales for the first half of the year, quarter one to quarter two. So you can drag that capsule whether you're looking at quarters, days, or years as well. So that is the timeline. If you're working on a different schedule in terms of your fiscal year, what you can do is, let's say your fiscal year starts in February, you can highlight those first 3 months, and here's your quarter, your first quarter for your fiscal year. So that is the timeline tool. I'll go ahead and clear that filter, and we'll take a look at one more feature. We'll take a look at the pivot chart. I'm going to get rid of the timeline here. I'll click on it and just press the delete key. Again, just like the slicers, you can bring it back later if you wish to. But let's get some visuals in here. I'm going to click on Pivot Table Analyze. So as you can see, this is where we find a lot of our tools that we can use on the pivot table. Over to the far right, we have Pivot Chart. And so we're going to insert a pivot chart that tells a story about our data. Just gives us a nice visual representation of our data. I'll go ahead and click on Pivot Chart. And the good thing is it builds the chart for us. And it also allows us to choose the type of chart that we want to visualize our data. Here's a clustered column, which is a really good option. It allows you to display multiple series on the same chart, unlike the pie chart, which just allows one series at a time. So I'll go with that clustered column here. If you want to give it more of a 3D look, that's fine. I'll go ahead and press OK. And you can see it's already incorporating our data in there. So here you go. So here is my pivot chart that's telling a story about the data here. Make this a little bigger. You can move the chart if you want to. So if you click on the Pivot Chart Analyze tab, you can move the chart. You can also name the chart if you want to do that. But for now, I just want to change the appearance of the chart. So I'm going to click on the Design tab for the chart. And you can choose a quick layout. Right? The layouts just move things around like the legend or the title. Right? So you can choose a quick layout. I'm actually okay with this layout. You can change the colors. Right? So here's a second color palette, third and fourth. You can also go with a monochromatic color scheme on the bottom here as well. But I'll stick with this one. And then you can actually add a chart style. These really improve the look and feel of your chart. So here is style number 2. Right. So just some different. This one is pretty nice. It shows has a dark background and it shows the numbers on the top of the bar. But if you've taken my Excel classes, you know I like the style number 9, right? Nice dark theme, vibrant colors. Here's style number 10, and here's style number 11. I'll go for style number 9. There we go. I'll make my chart a little bigger. And there we go, right? So we can visualize our data based on our current pivot table. Now, our pivot chart is connected to our slicers, which are connected to our pivot table, which is connected to our chart. So they're all connected to each other. What does that mean? Well, if I filter my pivot table, my chart was going to be updated. If I use my slicer, my pivot table, and my chart will be updated. I can also filter from the pivot chart as well, in this case by region and associate. I'll click on the California button here on my region slicer. And notice how the chart has been updated. Right? Chart has been updated to reflect sales revenue for California. What about investments? I'm sorry, I have the multi turned on here. So here's California and investments. So here's a simple pivot chart that shows our data. Now I can use the pivot chart as well to filter my data. Let's say I want California and New York. I'll go ahead and press OK. And there you go. So notice they're all talking to each other. You can filter from the table, the slicer, or from the pivot chart as well, right? So each one gives you the capability to be able to work with the actual data. Well, let's see if I reconstruct my pivot table. Let's see if the chart will update right away. So instead of focusing on the revenue here, I'm going to remove the revenue. I'll just reset everything. And I want to focus on the transactions, right? I want the count of transactions by region. Right? And let's see, looks like I still have a filter in here. Clear that filter. Okay, so we have count of transactions by region and by, let's go for client. Right? So I've reconstructed the pivot table, and you can see the pivot chart has been updated to reflect what's being constructed on the actual pivot table. Right? So pretty cool. So those are the essentials when working with a pivot table. Right? You basically take your data, you insert a pivot table from that data, and then you can construct your pivot table just by moving fields to the different boxes. Right? Every time you move a field to a different box, you're basically answering another question there as well. So we are good to go. I'm going to put this back to the revenue. Right? So revenue by region and client. And there we go. Okay, I'll go ahead and stop here and go back to my slide deck here. Okay, so we were able to prepare data for analysis. We're able to analyze data with a pivot table. We're also able to create visuals with a pivot chart as well. So those are the essentials when working with a pivot table. Feel free to enroll in our course. We have a few courses coming up. September 24th, we have the full day course from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. On December 4th, we have the course from 6 a.m. to 1 p.m. as well. You can scan that QR code. It will bring you to the page where you can register for the actual course. But does anyone have any questions for me based on what we have covered? Any questions, any comments? Did you find this to be helpful or useful? Please let me know in the chat. You're welcome, Sarah. Excellent. Right. Eric, what's your question? Can the pivot table? Yes. So Eric, it can, right? You just have to figure out a way to quantify that qualitative data, right? So it can be, for example, so in this case, you may not have an ID column. You can count the number of occurrences, right? So that's one way to use the pivot table. So yes, you can. You just need to figure out how to express it in a quantitative way. Yeah. So it's not just for numerical data. Remember, you have the count function in there as well that you can use in other ways as well. Well, like for example, right? Let's say that these transactions were actual, let's say these were actual alphabetic, right? So let's say these were not numbers. We can still count. Remember, you can still count rows and you can still count columns, right? So you don't necessarily have to have a number. So for example, if I were to highlight a few services, I take a look at my status bar, it's telling me that I have 14 rows selected. So you can always use those features to quantify qualitative data. Right? But I don't really have a specific example. I wish I did, but yeah. But the answer is you can use pivot tables for qualitative data. Let's see. Other questions do we have? The recording, after you should be able to access this recording shortly after we finish here. So you should be able to rewatch the recording, and the file should be ready for you for later once you grab that file as well. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and stop here. Everyone, I hope this was helpful for you. Enjoy the rest of your day. We look forward to seeing you for our next live session. All right. Everyone, take care and have a wonderful day.